everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. And what we're going to be looking at is part 2 of our discussion related to is Kanye West right? And this is related to the 13th Amendment. We are going to look at an unusual dynamic in terms of history and slavery in this discussion related to reparations. And this relates to the crime of birth. And so what we're going to be first looking at is this dynamic whereby the courts and the colonies made birth a crime in order to provide slave labor for the colonists. This took place basically by either not allowing individuals to marry or not recognizing marriages or outlawing certain marriages between certain people and violating what were known as these racial purity laws and rules, also outlawing fornication and having mixed race children or what was considered non-marital children. There was the crime of bastardy and mulatto bastardy, and this involved heavy fines, imprisonment, enslaving people, enslaving the children. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of that, and then we're going to look at some of the court records so that you can see what took place in terms of these crimes and these indictments. And so you'll be able to see the individual parent names and you'll be able to see the children's names. And so in terms of tracing your ancestry, again, this may be another way for you to identify some of your ancestors. And if this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now let's quickly look at some of the plantation dynamics. We're going to use Maryland as an example. And so we're looking at some of the dynamics in the 1600s through to the 1700s. And so what you see here in terms of these plantations is the settlers, the colonizers, were taking a lot of land. And so you can see 1,000 acres, 500 acres, and they needed someone to work all of this land. And one way to get people to work the land for free was to enslave them. And so working with the court system in the colonies, they were able to acquire unpaid labor in order to work all of this land. And so what sometimes happens is individuals tend to think about those big plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama areas in terms of plantations, but not thinking about there were many plantations, and plantations are basically just large farms or workspaces where you have lots of people and lots of space to do it. And so you have with many of the colonists huge land tracts that they took, and you can see where they would definitely need someone to assist them when you're talking about farming on 1,000 acres or 500 acres or 100 acres. It's a lot of acreage. And what's helpful here is that you can actually see the names of the individuals. You can see the name of the planter, you can see the name of the tract, you can see the acreage, and you can see the date. So if you have some ancestors that were in the area during this time, you might have an easier time tracing them based upon this information. The promise was unkept. Now, before we go into looking at the actual crime of birth, we're going to look at some information related to this dynamic known as bastardy. And what was going on was they were taking some of the dynamics from England, from Europe, and bringing them into the Americas, and then putting that into the cultural space. And so what happened was you had the Puritans who had very strict rules about the way that they believed the world was supposed to operate. And that was transplanted from Europe over into the Americas. And so what was really interesting, however, was that the bastardy laws that were used in the United States, in America, in the colonies, they were stricter than the ones that were used in Europe. And we're going to look at some of the dynamics that were going on in Europe during this time, including a king who had multiple non-marital children. As a matter of fact, there were multiple nobles and monarchs who had non-marital children, and there was no problem with this. And so it's just a very interesting dynamic whereby this was made into such a big issue in the colonies in order to create this free workforce. And there are a few reasons why you know that this was just fabricated. And you see up here where it says the sources of Anglo-Saxon law reveal little interest in the status of children because family relations were determined by the membership of the group or the clan rather than the legal status of those parents. And so the child always had a family according to Anglo-Saxon law. And so they were not really interested in whether the child was a marital child or a non-marital child. So again, this is something that was created and mushroomed in Jamestown and in the other colonies. Now, we just talked about child theft basically coming from England into the Americas. And another way of creating this child theft dynamic involving the courts also was to create this dynamic known as bastardy and have all of these rules related to quote unquote legitimacy. And one of the things you'll note when they are talking about in this particular article related to what was going on in Italy, you can see that there was no real concern about this dynamic, and there was a notation that there had been no legitimate heir in such a long time in relation to what they considered to be the Christian nations for those monarchs. And so this again was not a big issue in Europe. It was made into a big issue in the colonies for political, economic reasons. Now, this is a really interesting article. It's related to bastardy, race, and law in the 18th century French Atlantic. And so one of the dynamics noted was that even though quote unquote illegitimacy was traditionally defined in France as birth outside of a legitimate marriage, in the colonies over here, it increasingly became associated with racial mixture. So this is a very interesting dynamic. It turned into a dynamic related to the racial purity laws. And so it didn't matter what the parent's status happened to be. The focus was on the actual race of the child. And so again, this was an interesting dynamic, an interesting turn of events that was totally inconsistent with what would be considered bastardy in Europe. And so again, they were changing this from related to the marital status of the parents to the racial makeup of the actual child. And so all of that is said to say that mixed race children by operation of law became illegitimate. Now, this article talks about a very interesting dynamic, and it relates to the American Indians. And what they were doing basically was also making American Indian children, they were bastardizing them based upon not recognizing the marriages of the American Indians, or when American Indians married anyone other than another American Indian. So the marriages weren't recognized, and then if they married someone else, those marriages were also not recognized. And so what happened was, what people did in terms of a marriage normally, it turned into the criminal act of fornication. And it was also used, this whole process was used to undermine the sovereign status of Indian nations. Now, as you may recall, related to the Puritans, they were wreaking havoc over in Europe and then continued to do so in the Americas. And so one of the dynamics that took place was that they were really involved in imprisoning people for what would be considered moral turpitude. And so there was a lot of focus on morality versus legality. And there was a turning of a number of things into crime. And so you had a lot of focus on adultery, fornication, and unwed parents. But the reason wasn't for really moral reasons in this particular situation. What the focus was on was economics, because all of this turned into an economic benefit for the colonists, for those planters, for those plantation owners. And what they were doing was they were turning parents into criminals. And by doing this, they were able to take their children, along with sometimes taking the freedom of the parents. Another interesting notation related to bastardy in Europe was this dynamic whereby after there was a significant push of people out of Europe who were considered quote unquote undesirable and pushed into the colonies, there appeared to be an upswing in terms of non-marital births. So this is very interesting because what they thought they were doing was pushing out the people who were not quote unquote behaving in many instances. And after this, you have this increase in non-marital births in the south of Germany. And here you can see a notation related to the period from 1750 to 1850. And the notation is that few single women had not given birth to illegitimate children during this time period. And then you see where they note, there's a little arrow down at the bottom, single women were conceiving 5 to 6 children out of marriage. Okay, now we're going to look at the actual prosecution records for Queen Anne's County. This is for the time period between 1728 and 1748, but you can actually look at the records for the entire time period. And so what you're going to see here is the names of the individuals and the crime that was charged. And you can see for these, we're looking at the fornication records. And for those who are not familiar with fornication, it basically means having sex outside of marriage. When an individual is married and has sex outside of the marriage, then it's considered adultery. So right now you can actually see the names of the individuals. You can see the male names, and then you can see the female names. Now, interestingly, sometimes the female name is missing. It's an interesting dynamic, but at any rate, you also see what took place. So you can see the indictments that have been ordered. You can see the information that has been ordered. You can see the warrants that have been ordered for these individuals. Now, again, knowing what you know now about surname analysis, you might be able to tell some things about the individuals. Of course, you see up top, you already see Mary Moore, and you see a number of other names that give you some indication as to where the individuals were from. And so you see a number of names. You see Daniel Barnett and Joseph Bartlett. You see Patrick Brady. You see John Flamer. You see John Goodall. You see Henry Hebard, John Hurley. Then for women, you see Elizabeth Meads. You see Mary Walker. You see Ann Gill. You see Ann Anderson. So this gives you a lot of information, and it might give you some indication as to a pathway to find some of your ancestors, because these individuals in many instances were enslaved because of these crimes that they were charged with. So not only did they have the crime of fornication, but they also had the crime of interacting in certain ways with people of a quote unquote another race. And so we're going to call these the swirling crimes. And so you can see up top you have an individual, you see the male names and you see the female names, and then you see the crime that is charged. So for William Harding, you see married a white. So that was a crime. You see Sarah Perlott married a white. What that also tells you is that William Harding and Sarah Perlott were likely either Negro or Black or Moor or Indian, and the individual, of course, the other individual would have been classified as white. So that also gives you some indication as to this person's identity. If you are confused about your family members' identities when you're looking through the records, and you might be inclined to not look at certain records because it doesn't fit the quote-unquote racial profile that you're looking for, but there may be a number of reasons for that, because they were playing around a lot with the identities of people. And so you see some additional notations of the crime being dealing with a servant, and then you see married to a Negro slave, and then you don't see the clarifications for the other ones. And then you also see a notation, no prosecution. And so it's possible the one for no prosecution did not involve cross-racial dynamics. And now you can see the records for some of these charges of bastardy. And this is where they had children out of wedlock. And you can see sometimes the name of the co-respondent. So you see the defendant off to the left, and you see the names. You have everything from Bailey to Baker to Banks to Barnett, Baynard, you have Bishop, you have Allen, Ambrose, Anderson, Armstrong, Atkinson, and you can see the names of the correspondent in some instances. And you see the crime charged is bastardy, and then you can sometimes see the actual punishment for some of them. You'll have to dig a little deeper to see the punishment for all of them. You can see instances where they received whippings. So you had 21 lashes, 10 lashes. There was a fine. You also see 30 shilling fine, 15 lashes, 5 lashes. And so this was treated as a crime, and there was punishment attached to it. This is one form of the punishment. The other form of the punishment involved enslavement and also enslaving of the children. Okay, one thing to remember when you're looking at these records is that for the most part, these individuals are considered brown people for the most part, because if you're talking about two quote-unquote white people, they were allowed to marry. And so when you're talking about someone marrying across races, or even individuals who are of the same race, so if you have two American Indians, those marriages wouldn't be recognized. If you have two brown Americans, or two people who would be considered Negro or Black coming from Europe, those individuals also were not able to marry in this particular structure. And so you can pretty much rest assured that these names are names belonging to brown people one way or another. And so you see additional charges of bastardy for a number of individuals. You have Elizabeth Kuhn, you have Sharpless Cooper, Elizabeth Corker, Mary Cornell. You have surnames of Croker, Crow, Dale, Damsey, Davis, Diaz. So you have quite a few, and you can see where individuals are charged multiple times for the children. And so what was going on also was they would go back and then make all of these charges related to all of the children. And the list goes on. Of course, this is not exhaustive. This is just a few of the court records. Okay, and so you have here additional charges, and you can see more names. So you see Mary Case, you see Alice Church, and again, you can see sometimes the person's name comes up more than once, and then you can also see the correspondent in a few cases. And then you see the charge of bastardy again. And then what's interesting, over to the right, for one individual, they have a fine of a 600-pound tobacco fine. And so that's a very interesting notation and punishment. It's not clear what all of that entails, but you can see some of this here. And then again, you have that 30 shilling fine. And then for some, you don't see any notation. And so it's possible, depending on what's going on, that there was a different penalty, and often that penalty was enslavement. They used a fancy term of bound out and indenture. But what we're talking about here is involuntary servitude. So we are talking about convict leasing. And here you see an additional list. And again, you have names from Fisher to French to Frost, Gibson, Gill, Goddard, Gorman, Gother, Galt. So you have quite a few names. Sullivan, you have Parmar, and you can again see the punishment, and there was no discrimination in terms of punishment. They would punish the men and punish the women, and you can see 15 lashes, 15 lashes, 15 lashes, and all of those individuals are female. And here you see a notation related to this list, and it says some of these bastardies might be mulatto bastardy, though not noted as such. And that might be the case simply because when you look at the names of the individuals, there is indicia of the ethnicity of the individual, starting with Mary Moore and Morgan, and then you have the surnames listed as mulatto. So Kate Mulatto, Catherine Mulatto, Mary Mulatto. Then you have William Mullet, you see Tally Tamazin, and Catherine Murphy, and Francis Murphy. And again, there is only a notation for fine at the top. And again, often what took place was enslavement, or what they considered convict leasing. And here is an additional list, and you can see additional names such as Jacob Boone, you see Boswell, Sarah Bryan, Bryant, Burkett, Byrne, Burns, you see Calker, Callaghan, you see Cameron, Campbell, Carmen, Carty. And so as you can imagine, if someone's unable to pay the fine, then that's going to present a problem and likely result in yet another penalty. And here you see a notation at the top. These are all for mulatto bastardy for this list. And so you see Elizabeth Green, Alice Roberts, you see her name twice, Isabella Robertson, Judith Scott, Rebecca Whittam, and you see for one 7 years servitude up top. Now, many people are thinking that this means that this was a regular indentured servitude contract where the individual entered into this bad employment contract. But as you can see here, this is a part of a criminal prosecution. And so this is basically like jail or convict leasing. So the convicts are leased out, are bound out for this servitude. And here we have bounding out and basically enslaving people. And so we're going to look at the Cousins family, the Cousins, and we've talked about them before. And so we're going to put it in some context here. And so what you see here is a dynamic. If you look over to the left-hand side, there was a show cause hearing. And the individual needed to show cause why the children should not be bound out. And so why the children should not be enslaved. The person did not appear, and you can see the listing of what took place with this. So because the parent did not appear, you see all of the children being bound out again. And you see them listed as mulatto child of Mary Cousin, and he was bound out again. You see bound out again for the other one. You see James bound out again. And they are bound out to different people. So they are just sending the children out to work for a variety of people. Again, convict leasing. Now the children did nothing wrong. However, this was the punishment for the parent having the children in the first place. And then you look down further and you see additional bounding out And you see for this individual, her children, Sal, John, and Celia, were ordered bound out. And you see where they are going, and you see that term apprentice. Also, again, these children were enslaved, and they were bounding them out often for the entirety of childhood and adulthood. And the world has come to see just how proud. Now we're going to revisit this discussion related to this particular resource. And what's interesting about this in terms of all of this bounding out is this discussion about East Indians. This is why a Truth Commission is essential. You have this dynamic where they are talking about East Indians in the colonies in the 1700s. And so you have apparently East Indians and then Indians on the mainland of America that are indigenous. And you have this mixing going on with those groups. And another interesting notation off to the left, you see East Indians apparently blended into the free African American population. It identifies an individual named Peter, an East Indian who was the ancestor to the Fisher family, and that he had a child with a white woman named Mary in about 1680. And you also see another notation where it says, the indenture of Indians as servants was not common in Maryland. And so that's another interesting notation. But what's important is figuring out exactly which Indians they are talking about. And so this is one of the first indications that there are different Indians operating in the same place at the same time. And so when you're reading historical records, it's important to find out which Indians are they talking about. What you see up top on the right-hand side is the indenture of East Indian servants was more common. And in the middle there, you see Eliza Lester, and there's a comment on her receiving fine or corporal punishment in Baltimore County. And also you see another indictment notation related to mulatto bastardy and also punishment for fornication. And also the child was begot by an Indian. Again, it's important to find out what type of Indian are they talking about. And so you can see a number of situations going on here related to mulatto bastardy. This all goes back to the racial purity laws. Were they really that concerned about Indians with other people, or with quote unquote white people with other people? Or were they really trying to push this agenda related to racial purity? And we're going to revisit this dynamic whereby you have all of these individuals who are listed as free persons of color with ancestry. The mother of the family was a quote-unquote white woman in colonial Maryland. And so you have a number of families that were headed by a female who was quote-unquote white. And so these would have all been considered quote-unquote mulatto children or mulatto descendants. Now, of course, you don't know what they look like today because there are lots of things that can happen between the 16 and 1700s and now. And so again, though, you get to see the names listed for these different counties. You have Prince George's County, you have Charles County. So you have a number of the counties listed, Kent County, talking about in Delaware. So you have a number of counties listed, so you can actually trace back pretty easily to these counties because these people were considered free persons, and so they were free at this time. There's no indication as to what was going on with the other parent. And so that might be something to research. But at least if you have any ancestry in the Maryland, Delaware area, this information may be helpful for you tracing your ancestry. And here you can see additional notations related to registers in the court records. And so you see county records, and you see county judgment records, you see criminal proceedings records. Again, you see all of these records for these different counties. You have Talbot, you have Prince George, you have Kent. And so you have a variety here, and you know that you can look in court records and also church records in those areas to get more information about ancestors. So if any of these surnames seem like they are even remotely related to your surname and your family comes from this area, this is definitely a road that you might want to go down. Now we're going to quickly look at the Allen family, and this is a similar dynamic related to the Cousins family. And so you see here, this is 1753, that Jane Allen was living in Prince George's County in August of 1772 when the court ordered her to serve an additional 7 years of her indenture for having an illegitimate child, quote unquote, by a Negro, and then bound her son to serve someone for 31 years. Now, clearly, many people are arguing that this is just indentured servitude and this is something that people contracted to do, but this is not about a contract. This is about a criminal prosecution. This is about enslaving people based upon purported violations of the law. And this is involuntary servitude. There is no contract going on. This is a person being ordered to be enslaved. And in this instance, you have children who had nothing to do with any of this, and they are being enslaved for a lifetime simply because they were born to parents who did not have, quote unquote, a legitimate marriage. And so you are talking about someone bounding someone out for a period of 31 years. And this is after a person has already been enslaved, and now they are being enslaved for an additional 7 years. And then the children are being enslaved along with the parent. And off to the right, you see Hannah Allen, born around 1730, and was the mulatto servant of Joshua Clark. So this again gives you some names to follow. And you see the charge of mulatto bastardy on 4 occasions. She was ordered to serve her master an additional 7 years for each offense. And her children were bound to her master until the age of 31. And so basically for a lifetime is what you're talking about. And so you can see the children were 5 weeks old, 6 months old, 3 months old on these different dates. And so you are talking about children who were enslaved basically from birth because the parents were not considered married. And so individuals, historians, courts can call it whatever they want to call it. It is essentially slavery. If you are not free to not do it, and you are bound to a master for a period of time and you are unable to come out of that because you are for a lifetime guilty of mulatto bastardy, then you are basically enslaved. And this is what was going on with these ancestors for a number of people. And so it's very deceptive that people have been led to believe that these were regular, quote unquote, indenture contracts. When they see this, they think that people made a bad deal, and the bad deal is simply having children. The bad deal is marrying someone who is not recognized as a legitimate spouse. That's the bad deal in most of these instances. The settlers, colonizers, plantation owners, they needed free labor, and this is how they got it. And so the other thing to remember is that this was going on regardless of whether a person was Indian, European, African. Any of those mixtures created a legal problem for the parents. Now, as we are wrapping this up, hopefully people have a better sense now of why this situation requires a truth commission. You have too many variables going on related to the slave trade. You have the dynamic of people being enslaved who were indigenous, people being enslaved who were coming from Europe, people being enslaved who were coming from Africa. You have individuals using this dynamic known as bastardy, mulatto bastardy, fornication, invalidating people's marriages in order to create a slave class coming from all directions. And so you can see that a truth commission is essential in terms of dealing with reparations. You also should see now why I was integrating the plight of the American Indians with the plight of those who understand themselves as ADOS. These histories are interrelated. It is, however, understandable that individuals who are online are saying that they do not see these histories as entangled. They are entangled, however, but it's very perfectly reasonable that people don't want to see these as entangled, and they have different narratives. Slavery is slavery is slavery. You can call it indentured servitude. You can call it being bound out. When it takes on an involuntary nature and it's not a part of a voluntary contract, it is a penalty for a crime. It involves convict leasing. It involves blackbirding. It involves stealing of people's children. All of that is slavery, and it needs to be understood as that. It needs to be articulated as what it was and not glossed over. And this is the second to the last video discussion that we are going to be having on these topics. And we are going to wrap this up with a final discussion on important questions to ask related to reparations. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care.